All right, I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. And as Shri said, my name is Kathy Brennan, and I have been an evaluator now for about 15 years. And I have some very recent experience with developmental evaluation, so I'm very happy to talk with you about it today. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I want to hear a little bit more from you. 28% of you have some experience with developmental evaluation. But let me get a better sense of the crowd here. Who is a complete blank slate when it comes to developmental evaluation? There's nothing wrong with being a blank slate, so raise your hand high if you're a blank slate. Okay, I see some hands. Okay, and how many of you are at the far other end of the spectrum and have really either funded a developmental evaluation as a funder, or as a nonprofit, been a part of a developmental evaluation, or as an evaluator actually conducted a developmental evaluation? Raise your hands high. All right, okay. And the rest is somewhere in the middle. That gives me a very strong sense of who is in the room. I was told there'd be a big diversity in the room, and so what we're gonna do here today is really walk through it from the beginning to a little bit deeper. So we're going to talk about what is developmental evaluation, why developmental evaluation is so important to next generation evaluation, what is all the buzz about with developmental evaluation, how is developmental evaluation really different than other approaches, and what does developmental evaluation look like in practice? And I'll draw on a couple of examples from my work. So, what is developmental evaluation? That's my curious bird. So Michael Quinn Patton really wrote the seminal work about developmental evaluation, and this is the book, and everyone should mark it down if you haven't already seen it, because it's a go-to book for people who are doing this type of work. So developmental evaluation supports innovative development to guide adaptation to emergent and dynamic realities in complex environments. All right, those are a lot of words. But what I really want you to pull out here is the word innovative, development, adaptation, emergent, and complex. Because this is really fundamental to developmental evaluation. And let me tell a story. I'm going to try to recount a story that Michael Quinn Patton, who's kind of the granddaddy of evaluation. I don't know if he'd appreciate that. But the story that he tells about how he coined the term developmental evaluation. He was sitting with a client who was a social innovator and explaining to that client that now is the time where they were going to move from their formative part of the evaluation, where they've been tweaking the program around the edges, really learning about the program, and now they were moving to the summative part of the evaluation, where everything had to be held constant for 6 months to a year while they measured whether this thing really works, the proof of the program. The social innovator sat up, looked at Michael Quinn Patton, and said, "Are you kidding me?" As you know, social innovators are not ones to sit still. They're not ones to not pivot when they need to pivot if information tells them so. And so he was being told, you can't do anything with your program for the next 6 months to the year. He said to Michael Quinn Patton, formative, summative, is that all you've got? And that was the genesis of developmental evaluation. So why all the buzz? Why is developmental evaluation so important? So there were many, I hope all of you did have an opportunity to read the learning brief that was written, because it was very well done, and it really lays out in depth kind of the environment and what's going on that has set the stage for developmental evaluation. But I want to pull out one thing in particular, a new reality that I think has been one of the key levers that has led developmental evaluation to really gain a new space in the evaluation world. And it's something that I've noticed for a long time, and it's this movement of mainly philanthropy from the program model and funding programs to a much, much bigger focus on systems level change. I think a lot of philanthropies have looked back over the last 20 years, 30 years, however they've been around, and said, have we really made an impact? What kind of an impact have we really made? And if we're working at the program level, can we make the impact we want to make when programs are so often confounded by the systems in which they operate in? And so I've seen a sea change, a shift to really a focus on systems. And that has opened up an environment where developmental evaluation has emerged as an approach to evaluation of complex systems. All right, so what do we know about systems? Systems are generally complex, nonlinear, and dynamic, right? And what do we know about traditional models of evaluation? Traditional models tend to be focused on model testing, have a clear linear chain of event, have a logic model, predetermined activities, outcomes, outputs, focus on a fixed plan, utilize an external evaluator, neutral, and refine a model or make definitive judgment. Those are characteristics of traditional evaluation approaches. So what do you see here when you look at this? What yells out to you between column 1 and column 2? Anyone? Misalignment. Anyone else? Disconnect. Yes, that is right. Mismatch. This doesn't work. These two things do not mesh. How can we evaluate systems with something that looks like this? We can't. We can't very effectively. So this new reality really called for a new evaluation approach. Developmental evaluation offers evaluators, nonprofits, and funders a significantly different way of engaging in evaluation practice. And this way of engaging, instead of operating against a fixed evaluation plan that's very linear, very predictive, developmental evaluation offers a much more real-time learning-oriented approach to evaluation that can be particularly effective in early implementation of an initiative, particularly an innovative initiative. So how is developmental evaluation really different than other types of evaluation? So we've talked a little bit about this already. Traditional evaluation is linear. How many of you have helped develop a logic model or a theory of change? Raise your, whoa, all right. Very good. Okay, so this is kind of the going approach for how you plan for an evaluation. But often, not always, often logic models are very linear. You have your inputs, your activities, your outputs, your outcomes. They're very predictive. A is to lead to B to C. This is how you're going to get to the end. But in reality, that's not how things work in complex systems change. And what we found, I've found often, is with really complex work, having this linear predictive model can squelch the work, can squelch the innovation right on out of it. And it can be more harmful than a helpful plan. I like this slide, and this is a slide that Michael Quinn Patton, I saw him present with a few years ago, and I drew on it for this presentation. Mintzberg, Henry Mintzberg, is a premier organizational development guru, just in the field at large, not necessarily with nonprofits. But his whole idea of what a high-performing organization is and what they look like, high-performing learning organizations out there in the world, this is kind of what it looks like. You have your intended strategy, kind of your plan, your idea of what's going to go on, and then very quickly, when you start to implement, you realize that a whole portion of it needs to be thrown out because it's not working. And then parts of it do work, though. That's your deliberate strategy. And then you have all these unintended consequences, this emergent strategy that are not afterthoughts, that are really key quintessential parts to what you're doing that kind of come up and become part of your realized strategy. And I actually think that this model really fits how things actually work, how learning actually takes place, how movement is actually made in sectors, how learning organizations work. And there's this wonderful line I read recently, and I wrote it down here. Plan, but don't confuse planning with reality. And I think this model really kind of gets at that. There's a brilliant chart in the Hallie and Tanya Beer's articles evaluating social innovation, and here it is. And I just want to point it out because we're talking a lot about developmental evaluation right here today, because that's the topic, but that does not mean that there is not a place for more traditional formative and summative evaluation. And so this chart was actually a huge light bulb to me when I was directing the evaluation at Living Cities, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit, because it made me realize that we had used a kind of a blanket approach to evaluating our core initiatives, when in reality, some of our work was much more well-suited to developmental, and some of our work was much more well-suited to a formative approach. So when you're thinking about evaluation, things to think about when properly matching the evaluation approach to the work at hand is developmental. An initiative is innovating and in development. It's in creation. It's not developed yet, it's being created. Think of the words exploring, creating, emerging. With formative, the initiative is forming and under refinement. Think of improving, enhancing, standardizing. And with summative, think of the initiative is stabilized and well established, mature, predictable. I think one thing that as evaluators we need to get much better at is finding the correct approach for the work at hand. We all have kind of our favorite approach. We do clients, nonprofits, foundations a disservice by not being really thoughtful about correctly matching the evaluation approach to the work at hand. And it's very, very important. And this is a wonderful picture of how to think about this. So also in the Evaluating Social Innovation article, the Preskel-Beer article, 5 characteristics that distinguish developmental evaluation are pointed out. The focus of the evaluation is on innovation. The intentionality of learning of the evaluation, learning is just part and parcel of what it is about. The evaluation is emergent and responsive. The design has to be emergent and responsive to the needs at hand. The role of and position of the evaluator is much different. The kind of the external neutral evaluator, that's not part of developmental evaluation. This person is embedded. They are there. They are flexible. They are accessible. And that's very important to successful developmental evaluations. The emphasis is on using a systems lens throughout. All right, so we've covered what is developmental evaluation, why it's important, and how it's different from other types. And so now I'm going to just draw on a couple of examples from my work with developmental evaluation. And I want you to just think about, actually let me back up to this one. I want you to keep in mind these 5 characteristics as I'm talking, because they all play out in developmental evaluation. Pieces of them can play out in other types of evaluation, but they all play out in developmental evaluation. And so I just want you to keep these things in mind as I'm talking about the Living Cities example. Okay, so starting in 2011, I was the director of evaluation for Living Cities. And Living Cities is an organization that's just over 20 years old. And it's a collaborative fund of 22 big financial institutions and philanthropies who are really pooling their resources and brain power to work on issues of creating lasting improvements in the lives of low-income people in the cities where they live. So about 6 years ago at Living Cities, the way they did their work changed completely. Living Cities was kind of a traditional community development organization. I'm simplifying for the sake of telling the story, but a traditional community development organization. They pass through money to other organizations to build affordable housing on the ground in cities. They'd been doing this for years. Ben Hecht, the leader of Living Cities, came on board about 7 years ago and said, you know, we've been doing this for years, and have we made any impact whatsoever on poverty? I mean, the going thought in the community development field was if we give low-income people a place to live, then everything else will fall into place, right? But everything else didn't fall into place. It was kind of a simple solution applied to something that was very, very complex. And he said, no, I don't want to do business like this anymore. We're going to change what we do. We're going to change what we focus on. And these are the 3 levers of change that Living Cities is really working with now. All of you know about collective impact for systems change. Hopefully you've all read the collective impact literature, getting cross-sector people to work together on really complex issues, holding themselves accountable for results and setting a common agenda. Capital innovation, getting money to really work on the ground in cities, really work, being able to blend capital from the private sector, the philanthropic sector, and from the public sector. And public sector innovation. We can't leave the public sector out of this. So often I feel foundations and nonprofits are trying to okay, the public sector is over here, we're over here, but the fact of the matter is they hold a lion's share of the resources and have to be a partner in change in the cities always. And we have to figure out how to work more effectively with the public sector to really get things done. So the board, our 22 members said to us, and so our members are organizations, Living Cities members are organizations like Ford, the Annie Casey Foundation, Bank of America, Chase. And they really said, look, Living Cities, you're an innovator. You've never looked organizationally at your work. You need to do an evaluation. And we want you to use developmental evaluation. Now, these are forward-thinking people. And I think in the back of their heads, although never stated explicitly, I think they wanted us to test this out because they were very curious because there was a huge buzz about developmental evaluation. And so we said, okay, we'll test this out. And together we set these big, high, overarching goals. And you can see that these goals of the evaluation are very focused on learning. Staff members in the field learn from results. And we create a culture of learning and innovation internally and in our network. These are 2 of the core goals of the evaluation, set by our members in partnership with our members. Okay, how did we get started with this? How does this actually look in implementation? We selected consultants. We went a very non-traditional route. We did not select evaluators. We selected organizational learning experts to be very intentional about we want to focus on learning. And what we had found in the proposals that we had gotten back is that there was the folks who did traditional evaluation, and then there were learning experts. And one of the tensions we had was how difficult it is to find evaluators with all these different skill sets who can really do all of this well. We chose to go with organizational learning experts. 4th quadrant partners who are wonderful organizational learning experts. And we dove right in. We didn't have a theory of change. We didn't have a logic model. We dove right in, and we worked with each one of our core areas of work. Program, capital, and policy were the names at the time. And we said, what is a core learning question that's fundamental to you and for you to do your work well that you don't know an answer to right now in order to move your work forward? We're going to start with this question. We're going to start answering it. And that's how we started. About 6 months later, we came in and started to do a theory of change logic model process to have some sort of navigational star that we were aiming towards. To catch up in my notes here. what I want to do now is read the place where the developmental work really ended up taking off was in our capital work and our capital innovation work. One of the things that we had found, Living Cities is in the ground in 5 cities across the United States doing work on the ground. They also do work nationally with national partners. But one of the things we had found with our work on the ground was that capital, we had made the assumption that if you give a whole boatload of capital for a city to use to work on projects that would benefit low-income people, they would be raving, they'd be able to use all this capital. What we found was indeed that it was very hard in some cities for them to actually absorb and use the capital. The capital was made available, so the supply side was there to do these projects. They didn't necessarily have the capacity or the processes or the right people coming together to blend the capital to actually make it happen. And so this was an aha moment, and they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on with this? So the learning question that was picked on our capital work was, what will it take for Living Cities to influence the ability of underinvested communities to absorb capital, to actually use the capital that is available, because they weren't able to use it. And then they started working this question. Here are some of the tools we use. I'm running out of time, so I want to move a little bit faster. People always ask me, so what kind of tools do you use in developmental evaluation versus traditional evaluation? Well, some of the tools are the same. We use key informant interviews, stakeholder surveys. But two tools that were very, very important to this process was something we were called the before action review, after action review, and our meaning making, which is cross-department interpretation of data in real time. So let me talk just a little bit more about what those are, because these tools were really fundamental for us to really embedding a learning culture into everything we do, into our daily strategy. So if any of you have done research on learning organizations, one of the things that you'll find is learning organizations get really good at this whole idea of preview, review. What do you think you're doing? What actually happens in real time? So the before action review, after action review really helped us do this. A before action review is before core partners are coming together to really do co-creation. So a critical event is about to happen. Before that, we would prepare for that by asking ourselves, what are our intended outcomes or results? What challenges do we anticipate to getting those results? What have we learned from previous situations? And what will we do differently this time to make sure we're successful? Then on the back end of those events, we would ask ourselves, what were our intended results? What were our actual results? What led to the results? And what will we do differently if we didn't get the results that we had wanted to get? So we were doing this in real time, asking these questions in real time, constantly around our big learning questions. The meaning making was more on the back end when all the data would come in, getting all of our stakeholders together to say, I wasn't doing the analysis as the evaluator, they were doing the analysis. What does this mean? What does this mean for our work? Does this mean we stay the course? Or does this mean we need to pivot now? And we were doing this in real time throughout the evaluation. So some of our key learnings with the evaluation. Developmental evaluation was absolutely the right tool to strengthen the learning muscle of us, Living Cities. Living Cities had a lot of the core pieces in place. We had a leader, Ben Hecht, who absolutely embraced learning and thought it was so important for our organization. We had a culture that was open to learning. What we didn't have in place when we started with our developmental evaluation was easy to use processes to really embed learning into our culture. And with the meaning-making process, with the before action review, after action review process, we really had these tools and techniques, and that really took off. And also with our members, after we did this process, a lot of them started to do developmental evaluation in their work because they saw how much it had impacted our organization and our ability to quickly learn and move our work forward. I had mentioned earlier that we had, about 6 months in, started to build some sort of overarching theory of change to be our navigational star. And that process didn't really work very well. And I still haven't figured that one out, actually. And there's a big debate in the developmental evaluation field. It wasn't just with me, about what role does the theory of change or logic model play, if it does play at all a role in developmental evaluation. I've heard Hallie in her work say she's used systems maps instead, other things. So I still don't quite know. You need some sort of navigational star, but I'm not sure what that looks like. And we never quite did figure that out very well. Different parts of our work were at different levels of development. Different parts of our work were more innovative than others. And some of our work needed a developmental approach. Some of our work needed a more formative approach. Our board had asked us to do a developmental evaluation, blanket statement of everything we did. But some of our pieces of work didn't really call for that. They needed more of a formative approach. The capital innovation stuff absolutely thrived on the developmental approach. And the other thing we learned is just the huge, broad range of skill sets that's needed to really do developmental evaluation well. You need to be grounded in research methods. You still need all the core skills of an evaluator, but then you need to be a fantastic facilitator. You need to be able to ask those really hard questions at the right time. It's a huge amount to ask for one group or one type of person. And I wonder how many groups are out there that can do it all, do developmental well and do other types of evaluation well. So those were our key learnings. And here are some key resources that Living Cities has started a new strategy called open sourcing social change. So they have brilliant research and information up on their website, and I encourage you to use it. These are 3 resources about our developmental evaluation. This is my contact information and questions. There we go. Anyone have any questions about my very quick overview of developmental evaluation?
It said that there are some mics that people
I see a hand.
Yeah,
Oh, I see a person.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could talk, one of the very early slides you showed had the 3 goals for the developmental evaluation. And I was wondering if it was difficult building consensus around those goals, if different people in the organization had very different learning objectives, and if that was a point of tension, or if people pretty quickly coalesced around those. What were the challenges you faced in doing
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me move back to those. Oops, too far. So these goals were already in place when I came on board. And our members, our board, helped to develop these. And they're very focused on learning. So you would think, oh, everyone had already coalesced around these. But indeed, there was a huge tension between the focus on learning and, okay, in a year and a half, we have to report something to the board. And what is that going to be? What are our results going to be? They seem very clear-cut, but we did have to manage the balance, the reality between our focus on learning and also being accountable to the board to really show our learning in a way that was meaningful to them. So in a way, show our results. So we had these goals, everyone stuck to them, but there was a tension, not tension, we had to constantly be doing a balancing act between learning and then thinking about how can we show accountability to our board for that learning. Anyone? Hi.
Excuse me. Hi. Thank you so much. This was really helpful for
Oh,
me
thank you.
as a newbie on developmental evaluation. I had a question on the tools and resources, or tools and techniques.
Yeah.
The before action review, post, after action review.
Yeah.
How do you select those actions, those critical events for those reviews?
That's a really good question. We tended to select events where co-creation was about to happen, where we were getting a lot of key cross-sector stakeholders in a room. We knew kind of where we were we had a strategy in mind, and we wanted to make sure we moved the conversation forward, and that's when we would generally use it. They were generally meetings of key players, but places where co-creation was going to happen. And in order to move our innovation forward, in order for us to get learning, to learn more about how capital, for example, how capital can be absorbed better in places. So it was usually around an important event around co-creation. Does that make sense? Important, where minds are coming together to think on something, to learn. Oh, just one more question. Yeah.
So, thanks very much for a really interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I'm trying to reconcile two things in my mind that I think I heard you say. So one is that developmental evaluation is particularly appropriate at a kind of an early stage in the creation. Okay. When you're making changes in response to things that you observe in the short term, presumably. And then the other is that it's particularly appropriate for looking at systems change. And systems change is such a long-term ambition. So maybe I misunderstood, but I'm trying to sort of fit the kind of method of development evaluation with the phenomenon that you're trying to, learn about.
Yeah. Well, I think every initiative that you're working on is different, and this is a really good question. For us, in some of our initiatives and in our innovations, coming in early with developmental evaluation is important. I know some organizations that are working on systems change work that they're only going to keep doing developmental evaluation throughout, and that's going to be their main, for a long time, that's going to be their main approach to evaluation. I think with us, as things were moving, we needed to, again, it was part of the accountability question. At what point do you know, have you built your innovation enough when you can start doing different types of measurement? And I think that's always a balance. You have to figure that out for yourself. So I think developmental evaluation can be the approach used for systems change evaluation over the long haul for a lot of things. I think once things start to become more model-like, if you're putting in a specific model, which some of our stuff fit in that rubric, then you can move to different types of evaluation. So it depends, I guess, on what your project looks like and how the movement or innovation is rolling out. With really long-term systems change projects where it's constantly innovating, constantly changing, I can see developmental evaluation being the approach over the long haul. Oh, that's it. Thank you.